Is this some kind of joke? Staff Sergeant Coleman's voice sliced through the morning heat at Marine Corps Base Hawaii's precision rifle range. He wasn't addressing his struggling Marines, but the elderly man standing quietly behind the safety line. Do you even know where you are, old-timer? Roberto Bobby Sandoval, 78 years old, and wearing the simple green polo shirt of base landscaping crew, didn't react to the hostility. He held a long canvas-wrapped bundle in weathered hands. His posture relaxed despite the confrontation. His dark eyes, sharp as obsidian, missed nothing as they tracked the wind indicators scattered across the range. Each flag told a different story, a symphony of air currents that the young Marines' advanced equipment couldn't interpret. This is an active live-fire range for designated marksmen, Coleman continued, stepping closer. He embodied everything the modern Marine Corps represented: lean, confident, equipped with technology that cost more than most people's annual salary. The ballistic computer strapped to his wrist could calculate solutions faster than the human mind could process. Civilian access is strictly prohibited. You need to leave immediately. Bobby's gaze drifted from the heat-shimmered terrain to the staff sergeant. His eyes held the kind of depth that comes from seeing too much, weathered by experiences. Coleman couldn't begin to comprehend. "Wind's got layers today," Bobby said quietly, his voice carrying a slight Puerto Rican accent softened by decades in California. "Your machines only read the bottom one." Coleman let out a harsh laugh. Several younger Marines shifted uncomfortably behind their high-tech rifles. They'd been struggling with this range all morning, their state-of-the-art Kestrel weather meters providing contradictory readings while their ballistic computers calculated solutions that proved worthless shot after shot. The target, a steel silhouette at 1,600 yards, might as well have been on another planet. "Layers, huh?" Coleman scoffed, crossing his arms. "Listen, Grandpa, I appreciate the folk wisdom, but we have actual equipment for that. We're dealing with Coriolis effect, spin drift, and atmospheric pressure that changes every 10 minutes. It's a bit more complex than watching grass blow." Bobby offered a non-confrontational shrug. "That computer can't see the thermal rising off those rocks at one, can't feel the downdraft from that gully on the right. The flag at your target is showing you yesterday's wind. By the time your bullet gets there, everything's changed." One of the younger Marines, Corporal Martinez, lowered his spotting scope. He'd been watching the mirage dance and shift all morning, and what the old groundskeeper said made disturbing sense. The heat waves were flowing in completely different patterns at different ranges, creating invisible rivers of air that no instrument could map in real time. But he wouldn't dare voice that observation. Not to Staff Sergeant Coleman. Coleman's face tightened with wounded pride. This old landscaper, he'd seen him trimming hedges around the bachelor quarters, was lecturing him on precision shooting. "And I suppose you could do better," he challenged, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He gestured at the bundle in Bobby's hands. "What have you got there anyway? Your grandfather's hunting rifle?" Slowly, deliberately, Bobby began to unwrap the canvas bundle. What emerged wasn't a modern tactical rifle with carbon fiber furniture and an adjustable chassis. It was something from another era entirely. A weapon that spoke of wars fought when the stakes were absolute. The walnut stock was dark with age and countless applications of linseed oil, bearing honest scars and dings that told of hard, purposeful use. The action was a classic bolt design, and the scope mounted above was simple glass without the complex turrets and illuminated reticles that adorned the rifles on the firing line. It was an M40A1, the sniper rifle that had served American marksmen through Vietnam and beyond. A genuine piece of military history. The Marines stared in fascination. Most had only seen such rifles in museums or historical displays. To see one here, in the hands of this unassuming groundskeeper, was surreal. Coleman let out a disbelieving chuckle. "You cannot be serious. That antique probably can't even reach the target, let alone hit it. The throat erosion alone would make it worthless for precision work." He pointed at a particularly deep gouge in the rifle's stock, near the action. "Look at this thing. It belongs in a display case, not on a firing line. You're going to hurt yourself with that relic." The moment Coleman's finger touched the worn wood, Bobby's world shifted. The blazing Hawaiian sun dissolved, replaced by the suffocating humidity of a Vietnamese jungle. He was no longer 78, but 19 years old, lying in a hastily constructed hide, overlooking a contested valley. The same rifle, then new and proud, rested against sandbags. The gouge Coleman had mocked was fresh, shrapnel from a mortar round that had bracketed his position moments before. Through that same simple scope, he watched enemy soldiers moving through the tray line below, preparing to assault his company's Firebase. His spotter's voice echoed across the decades. "Easy, Bobby, make it count, hermano. Our boys are counting on it." The memory ended with the sharp crack of the M40, its report echoing off the jungle canopy. Back on the modern range, Bobby's eyes refocused on Coleman. The staff sergeant was still talking, still mocking, but his words seemed to come from very far away. Corporal Martinez watched the entire exchange with growing unease. He was a good Marine who respected the chain of command, but he also respected his elders. Something about the staff sergeant's blatant disrespect felt fundamentally wrong. More than that, there was something familiar about the old man. Martinez had seen him around the base for years, always quiet, always keeping to himself. But he'd also heard whispers from the older NCOs at the armory. Legends about the quiet groundskeeper who used to be somebody special. "I'm not going to ask again, sir," Coleman continued, his voice hardening. "This is a restricted area. You're a civilian creating a safety hazard. Put that weapon down and step away from the firing line before I have you arrested for trespassing." Martinez knew he couldn't directly confront his staff sergeant, but he could make a call that might prevent a serious mistake. "Staff sergeant," he said, standing up from his shooting position. "My scope's thermal drift is way off. Think the electronics failed in this heat. Request permission to take it to the armory for diagnostic." Coleman, frustrated and distracted by the confrontation, waved a dismissive hand. "Fine, just get it fixed fast. We're not securing this range until somebody hits that target." Martinez grabbed his optic and jogged away from the firing line, his heart pounding with purpose. Instead of heading to the repair shop, he ducked behind a line of tactical vehicles and pulled out his phone, scrolling to a number he hoped would answer. The phone rang twice before a gravelly voice picked up. "Armory Master Gunnery Sergeant Reyes speaking." "Master Guns, this is Corporal Martinez from Weapons Company. I need to ask you something urgent." "What's the situation, Martinez?" "I'm out at Punchbowl Range with Staff Sergeant Coleman's designated marksman. There's an elderly gentleman here, one of the groundskeepers. Staff Sergeant Coleman is about to have him detained for trespassing." There was a pause on the other end. "The quiet guy with the slight limp, always working around the base." "That's him, Master Guns. But here's the thing, he brought an old sniper rifle with him, an M40 from Vietnam-era, and the staff sergeant called him Roberto Sandoval." The silence on the other end was sudden and absolute. When Master Gunnery Sergeant Reyes spoke again, his voice was completely different, tight, urgent, and stripped of all casual conversation. "Son, did you say Roberto Sandoval? At Punchbowl Range right now?" "Yes, Master Guns. Listen carefully. Do not, under any circumstances, let Staff Sergeant Coleman lay a hand on that man. Do whatever you have to do to keep them separated. I'm making a call that's going to change everything." The line went dead, leaving Martinez with the distinct feeling that he had just lit a very short fuse on a very large explosive. 5 miles away, in the command center of Marine Corps Base, Hawaii, Colonel Patricia Santos was reviewing training schedules when her aide rushed in without knock. "Ma'am, priority call on your secure line from Master Guns Reyes. He says it's a TET protocol." Colonel Santos frowned. There was no such protocol in any manual, but Reyes was a 28-year Marine who had served with legends. He didn't engage in dramatic exaggeration. She picked up the phone. "This is Santos." What she heard in the next 30 seconds changed her expression from mild curiosity to profound shock. Her aide watched her knuckles turn white as she gripped the receiver. "Are you absolutely certain of that name?" she asked. After listening to the response, she slammed the phone down and stood up abruptly. "Get my vehicle, now, and tell the sergeant major to meet me at the front gate." Emergency response to Punchbowl Range. Back at the range, Staff Sergeant Coleman had reached his breaking point. The old man's quiet refusal to be intimidated was more infuriating than any argument would have been. "That's it," Coleman declared, his voice rising with frustration. "I'm done with this circus, sir. I am giving you a direct order to vacate this military installation." He stepped closer to Bobby, invading his personal space with aggressive body language. "If you refuse, I will place you under apprehension and have the military police escort you to a holding cell for interfering with a training exercise." To emphasize his authority, Coleman reached out and placed a firm hand on Bobby's shoulder, intending to physically guide him away from the firing line. Bobby didn't move. He didn't flinch. He simply looked at the younger Marine's hand, then up at his face. The expression in his dark eyes wasn't anger or fear. It was something closer to profound sadness, The weariness of a man who had seen too much disrespect for too many years. That's when the first siren cut through the desert air. It started as a distant wail, growing louder by the second. The sound was so out of place on the remote range that every Marine stopped what he was doing and turned toward the access road. A dust cloud was rising in the distance, growing larger and more ominous by the moment. It wasn't just one vehicle, it was a convoy, 2 black command vehicles and a military police cruiser, their emergency lights flashing as they tore across the desert toward the range at a speed that suggested national emergency. The convoy screeched to a halt just yards from the firing line, doors flying open before the vehicles had fully stopped. The first person out was Colonel Santos, her uniform immaculate despite the urgent response, her face a mask of controlled fury. Right behind her came Sergeant Major Williams, a man who looked like he had been carved from volcanic rock and tempered in the fires of multiple combat deployments. The entire range went dead silent. The Marines who had been watching the confrontation snapped to perfect attention. Staff Sergeant Coleman froze, his hand still on Bobby's shoulder, a look of utter confusion and dawning horror spreading across his face. Colonel Santos ignored Coleman completely. Her eyes were locked on Bobby Sandoval with an expression of profound respect mixed with barely controlled anger at what she was witnessing. She strode forward, her boots crunching on the gravel, and stopped directly in front of the elderly man. She looked pointedly at Coleman's hand on Bobby's shoulder, and her eyes narrowed to dangerous slits. Coleman snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned by live electrical wire. Then something happened that would be talked about in Marine Corps barracks for decades. Colonel Santos, a full colonel in command of one of the Corps' premier training facilities, snapped to the sharpest, most picture-perfect salute any of the Marines had ever witnessed. Her voice carried across the silent range with unmistakable authority and respect. Gunnery Sergeant Sandoval, "Sir, I apologize for the inexcusable conduct of my Marines." A collective gasp rippled through the line of young Marines. Staff Sergeant Coleman looked like he had been turned to stone, his jaw slack and face ashen. In less than 30 seconds he had gone from complete command authority to being the target of his colonel's wrath. Sergeant Major Williams approached Coleman with the quiet menace of an apex predator. "Staff Sergeant," he said in a whisper that somehow carried more threat than any shout, "what in the name of God did you think you were doing?" Colonel Santos held her salute until Bobby gave a slow, tired nod of acknowledgement. Only then did she drop her hand and turn to face the stunned group of Marines. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the absolute authority of command, "you have been failing this exercise all morning because you believe the technology hanging on your rifles makes you marks. You have been humbled by 1,600 yards of air and shifting wind." She gestured toward Bobby, "and in your frustration, your leader chose to direct his disrespect toward a man whose combat boots he is not worthy to clean." The colonel's voice rose, ensuring every word carried across the range. "Allow me to educate you about the man you have been disrespecting. This is Gunnery Sergeant Roberto Sandoval, United States Marine Corps, retired after 24 years of service." She paused, letting the rank sink in. Gunnery Sergeant, a rank that commanded respect from every Marine present. Gunnery Sergeant Sandoval served 3 tours in Vietnam with 1st Force Reconnaissance Company. He participated in Operations Hastings, Prairie, and Niagara, conducting deep reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines. The legendary operation names hung in the air like thunder. Every Marine present knew those names from their history classes, but to hear them attached to the man they'd been mocking was surreal. In 1969, during the siege of Firebase Charlie, Gunnery Sergeant Sandoval held sniper overwatch for 18 hours while his unit was surrounded by 2 companies of North Vietnamese regulars. His precision fire prevented enemy forces from overrunning the position until reinforcements arrived. Colonel Santos consulted her tablet, though it was clear she was reading from memory. He was awarded the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in action, the Silver Star for gallantry, and the Bronze Star with V device for valor. She looked directly at Coleman, whose face had gone pale. "And one more thing, Staff Sergeant. In 1987 at this very range, Gunnery Sergeant Sandoval set the 1,600-yard precision shooting record that stood for 22 years, a record that every Marine sniper since has tried and failed to break." Colonel Santos finally lowered her tablet and turned her glacial stare on Coleman. Her voice wasn't loud, it didn't need to be, each word carried the weight of absolute authority. "Staff Sergeant, you mocked his rifle. That rifle has more combat experience than your entire company combined. You mocked his age. That age was earned in jungles you can't imagine, fighting for the freedom that gives you the privilege to wear that uniform. Bobby Sandoval stepped forward, his weathered hand gently touching the colonel's starched sleeve. "Colonel," he said quietly, his voice carrying the soft authority of someone who'd earned the right to speak. "The boy's young. We were all young once." He turned to face Coleman, and there was no anger in his dark eyes, only the deep, patient wisdom that comes from surviving what most people couldn't imagine. "Son," Bobby said, his voice gentle but clear enough for everyone to hear, "this rifle, this scope, they're not about the technology. They're about respect. Respect for your equipment, respect for your mission, and most of all respect for the Marines who depended on you to do your job right." As his hand rested on the scarred M40, another memory surfaced with crystal clarity. Firebase Charlie, his spotter Carlos bleeding out from mortar shrapnel while enemy snipers closed in on their position. The scope had been damaged, its housing cracked, but Bobby had kept shooting, kept the perimeter secure, kept his brothers alive. Carlos's last words echoed across the decades. "You did good, hermano. You kept the faith." A steady hand and a clear eye, Bobby continued, tapping his chest. "They don't come from a factory. They come from here, and from here." He tapped his temple. "The Marine makes the rifle, not the other way around." Colonel Santos watched this exchange with something approaching awe. In 25 years of military service, she'd rarely seen such grace in the face of humiliation, such wisdom in response to ignorance. "Gunnery Sergeant Sandoval," she said formally, "would you honor us by demonstrating what precision shooting really means?" Bobby nodded slowly, and walked to the vacant firing position. The crowd of Marines, including a deeply humbled Coleman, formed a silent semicircle behind the firing line. The range had been cleared except for Bobby, giving him the stage he'd never asked for but clearly deserved. He settled behind the M40 as if he were coming home. No dramatic adjustments, no calculated preparations, just the smooth, practiced ritual of a master craftsman approaching his work. The rifle seemed to melt into his shoulder, his breathing slowed to the rhythm of someone who'd learned to find calm in chaos. The vintage scope, scratched and scarred but lovingly maintained, showed him a target that existed not just as steel and paint, but as a problem to be solved with 40 years of accumulated knowledge. Bobby made a few simple adjustments to his scope, confident corrections, based on a lifetime of reading conditions that no computer could calculate quickly enough to matter. The shot came as naturally as breathing. The crack of the M40 echoed across the valley, followed by a silence so complete it seemed to press against the eardrums. Every Marine present held their breath, waiting for the target display to register the impact. When the numbers flashed on the electronic scoreboard, the silence broke with a roar that could be heard across the entire base. Perfect hit, and Bobby Sandoval had just broken his own 35-year-old. The thunderous applause that erupted from hundreds of Marines was more than appreciation for exceptional marksmanship. It was recognition of something larger, the moment when legend became reality, when history walked among them, and proved that some things transcend time and technology. Bobby slowly rose from his shooting position, the M40 cradled in his arms like something sacred. He looked around at the sea of young faces, all staring at him with a mixture of awe and newfound respect that he'd never sought but had certainly earned. Sergeant Major Williams approached Coleman with barely contained fury. "Staff Sergeant," he said in a voice that could cut steel, "you have 30 seconds to explain how you nearly detained a Medal of Honor recipient." Coleman's face went ashen. "Medal of Honor, Sergeant Major?" Colonel Santos consulted her secure tablet, reading from files that most of the Marines present didn't have clearance to access. "The citation is classified, but Gunnery Sergeant Sandoval's actions during Operation Purple Martin prevented the overrun of 3 Firebase positions and saved an estimated 200 Marine lives." She looked directly at Coleman. "For 23 years since his retirement, he's worked quietly on this base, maintaining the grounds where young Marines like you train for the conflicts he hoped you'd never face. He never asked for recognition. He never demanded respect. He just served." Bobby gestured toward the gardening truck that still sat behind the firing line, its humble presence now seeming almost surreal. 40 years ago, when I retired from the Corps, base commander offered me a choice: pension and civilian life, or stay on base doing whatever work needed doing. Said there'd always be a place here for Marines who'd given everything." He looked around at the assembled crowd, figured keeping the place beautiful was a way to keep serving, never expected to be back on the firing line. Coleman stepped forward, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "Gunnery Sergeant, sir, I owe you a profound apology. I said terrible things, made assumptions based on ignorance, You saw what your experience told you to see, Bobby corrected gently. That's natural, but survival often depends on seeing beyond expectation. In the jungle, the most dangerous enemy was often the one who looked harmless. Over the following weeks, Bobby began working with Coleman and other young Marines who sought him out. His lessons went far beyond marksmanship. He taught them patience, observation, the importance of respecting not just their equipment, but the legacy it represented. This rifle, Bobby would say, holding up the scarred M40, brought me home from a war that took too many good Marines. I've maintained it, respected it, treated it like family because it earned that respect through service. The young Marines learned that precision shooting was as much mental discipline as physical skill. Bobby taught them to read environmental conditions that their ballistic computers couldn't calculate, to develop the kind of awareness that had kept him alive in places where a moment's inattention meant death. Technology will fail you, he'd tell them during training sessions. When that happens, you fall back on fundamentals. 3 months after the incident that had changed everything, Coleman approached Bobby with a request that showed how profoundly the experience had transformed him. "Gunnery Sergeant," Coleman said, his voice carefully respectful, "I know I don't deserve to ask, but would you consider being my mentor, not just for shooting, for everything? How to be the kind of Marine you are?" Bobby studied the young man for a long moment. The arrogance was gone, replaced by genuine humility and hunger to learn. It was the kind of transformation that gave an old Marine hope for the future. "Son, the first thing you need to understand is that being a good Marine isn't about having the newest equipment or the highest score. It's about serving something bigger than yourself with honor and dignity." He gestured toward the rifle range, where other Marines were still training with their modern equipment. "All this technology you've got now, it's incredible. Things I could only dream about when I was carrying that M40 through the jungle. But technology is just a tool. What matters is the Marine behind it." Over the following weeks, Bobby began working with Coleman and other young Marines who sought him out. His lessons went far beyond marksmanship. He taught them about leadership through quiet example, about the difference between confidence and arrogance, about the responsibility that came with wearing the uniform. "This rifle," Bobby would say during their sessions, "has been with me for 50 years. I've cleaned it, maintained it, treated it with respect, because it earned that respect. It brought me home from places where good Marines didn't come home." The young Marines learned that true expertise came not from mastering technology, but from understanding the principles that made the technology effective. Bobby taught them to read wind patterns that no computer could map, to develop intuition based on observation and experience. "Your ballistic computers are impressive," he'd tell them, "but what happens when the battery dies? When the software glitches, when you're operating in conditions your equipment wasn't designed for?" Coleman proved to be his most dedicated student, arriving early and staying late, eager to absorb everything the old Marine could teach. The transformation was remarkable, from cocky technician to thoughtful leader who understood that teaching was as important as technical skill. "Gunnery Sergeant," Coleman said one afternoon after a particularly challenging training session, "my Marines are starting to approach problems differently. They're not just relying on their computers anymore, they're actually thinking." Bobby nodded approvingly. "That's the goal. Technology should enhance human judgment, not replace it. A Marine who can succeed when everything goes wrong is worth 10 Marines who can only succeed when everything goes right." 6 months after the range incident, Coleman received orders to scout sniper school. When he came to say goodbye, Bobby handed him a small notebook. "Field observations," Bobby explained, "things I learned that aren't in any manual. Study them, but more importantly, remember that every generation of Marines has lessons to teach if you're wise enough to listen." 1 year after the incident that had transformed his quiet retirement, Bobby Sandoval found himself in an unexpected position, standing before a packed auditorium at Marine Corps Base Quantico, addressing an audience of senior officers and master instructors. The invitation had come from the commandant himself, asking Bobby to present his methods to the Corps' leadership. At 79, he was finally receiving the recognition that his decades of quiet service had earned. "Gentlemen," Bobby began, his voice carrying easily to the back of the auditorium, "you've asked me to talk about marksmanship, but what I'm really here to discuss is legacy." He clicked to his first slide, not a complex ballistic chart or equipment diagram, but a simple photograph of young Marines training at the range where it all began. "Every new generation thinks they've discovered something revolutionary, but the fundamentals never change. Discipline, respect, understanding that you're part of something larger than yourself. The audience listened with rapt attention as Bobby described methods that seemed almost philosophical but were based on solid understanding of combat reality. He spoke of patience earned through experience, of wisdom that couldn't be programmed into computers, of the responsibility that came with carrying weapons in defense of freedom. The danger, he continued, is that we're raising a generation of Marines who can operate systems but have forgotten why we serve, who mistake technological proficiency for professional competence. After the presentation, a young captain approached Bobby with a question that struck to the heart of everything he'd been trying to teach. "Gunnery Sergeant, with all our advances in technology, what's the most important thing a modern Marine needs to understand?" Bobby smiled, recognizing the same eagerness he'd seen in Coleman and countless other young Marines who'd sought his guidance. "Son, the most important thing any Marine needs to understand is that this uniform represents a trust placed in you by every Marine who wore it before you, by the American people and by the Marines who will wear it after you're gone. Technology can't honor that trust, only character can." He paused, looking around the auditorium at faces representing the future of Marine Corps leadership. "I spent 24 years in uniform, and 30 years serving Marines in other ways. The proudest moment of my career wasn't any shot I made or any record I set. It was watching young Marines like Staff Sergeant Coleman learn what it really means to be part of something eternal." The standing ovation lasted nearly 10 minutes. 6 months later, the Sandoval doctrine had been officially integrated into Marine Corps Advanced Marksmanship program. Bobby found himself busier in his 80s than he'd been in decades, traveling between bases to train instructors who would carry his wisdom to the next generation. But perhaps his greatest satisfaction came from the quiet moments, when former students would visit, now seasoned Marines themselves, to share stories of how his lessons had guided them through their own challenges and helped them become the kind of leaders the Corps needed. 2 years after the incident that had transformed his retirement, Bobby Sandoval sat in his small garden near Marine Corps Base, Hawaii, watching the sunset paint the Pacific in shades of gold and crimson. At 80, he had officially retired from his retirement, his legacy secure in the hands of Marines who would carry his wisdom forward. The ceremony honoring his contribution to Marine Corps training had been simple but moving. Exactly what Bobby had requested. No media coverage, no elaborate presentations, just a gathering of Marines who understood what he represented. Staff Sergeant Coleman, now Gunnery Sergeant Coleman, and a distinguished instructor at the Scout Sniper School, was one of his regular visits. The transformation in the young Marine had been remarkable, from arrogant technician to thoughtful leader, who understood that mentoring was as important as marksmanship. "Gunnery Sergeant," Coleman said, settling into the chair beside him, "I wanted to tell you something. Last week, I had a new Marine in my unit who reminded me a lot of myself when we first met. Young, cocky, thought technology was everything." Bobby nodded, encouraging him to continue. "I remembered what you taught me about patience, about seeing potential instead of just problem. Instead of humiliating him, I took the time to mentor him, to share some of the wisdom you shared with me." "And," Bobby asked, though he could see the pride in Coleman's eyes, "he's turned into one of the finest Marines I've ever worked with. Says he wants to honor the tradition, to be worthy of those who came before him." Bobby was quiet for a long moment, watching a frigate bird soar over the harbor. "That's the real legacy, son. Not the records we set or the shots we make. It's the Marines we influence, who go on to influence others. It's the chain of service that connects every Marine to every other Marine, across time and distance." Coleman nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about responsibility and tradition, about what it means to be part of something bigger than yourself. That's the lesson your generation needs to learn," Bobby replied. "Equipment changes, tactics evolve, technology improves, but the spirit of the Marine Corps, the commitment to honor, courage and commitment, that's eternal." As darkness settled over the base, Bobby reflected on the unexpected turn his retirement had taken. He'd spent 30 years in quiet service, content to maintain the grounds where new generations of Marines trained for challenges he hoped they'd never face. Now, through a confrontation he'd never sought and recognition he'd never desired, his knowledge had found new purpose. The old ways hadn't just survived, they'd proven essential for understanding what military service really meant. Sometimes, Bobby thought, the best legacy isn't what you accomplish for yourself, but what you help others understand about honor, duty and the quiet pride that comes from serving something greater than your own ambition. The M40 propped beside his chair, the scarred rifle that had been his companion through war and peace, caught the last rays of sunlight, its worn surfaces telling stories that would live on in the Marines he'd taught to listen.